I remember the exact sound my skull made when it hit the hardwood floor. A wet, hollow thud that echoed in the empty house Dean had bankrupted us to buy. Then, there was just the smell of stale copper and nothingness. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't dead. I was 23 again, sitting on my childhood bed, smelling my mother's burnt pot roast. Downstairs, Dean was waiting to propose to me, and my sister, Harper, was already staring at him like he was a winning lottery ticket. The first thing I noticed was the oppressive, suffocating heat, not the cold, sterile chill of the hospital morgue I assumed I was destined for, but the damp, sticky humidity of a July evening in Maryland. My t-shirt clung to the small of my back. A ceiling fan wobbled above, clicking rhythmically. Click, swoosh, click, swoosh. I sat up. The sudden movement sent a wave of nausea crashing through my stomach, tasting faintly of the sour lemonade I drank hours ago. Or was it years ago? My hands flew to my chest, fingers frantic, searching for the jagged edges of broken ribs. There was nothing, just smooth, unbroken skin beneath cheap cotton. I pressed my palm against my sternum. The heartbeat there was fast, rabbit quick, but strong. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. July 14th, 2019. The day of the family barbecue. The day Dean got down on one knee in the backyard, holding a diamond ring he had bought on a credit card. He would later max out in my name. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. My knees shook. The floorboards were warm under my bare feet. I walked to the mirror, hanging on the closet door, and stared. The woman looking back wasn't the hollowed-out, bruised shell who had spent the last 5 years dodging debt collectors and Dean's unpredictable rages. Her cheeks were full. Her hair was glossy. She looked stupid. She looked incredibly, painfully naive. Nora! The voice drifting up the stairs felt like a physical blow to the back of my head. My mother. Nora! Dean is here. Bring down the extra napkins. I gripped the edges of the dresser. The wood dug into my palms, sharp and real. This wasn't a dying hallucination. I was here. I had crawled backward through time, dragging my consciousness out of the wreckage of a life that hadn't happened yet. I didn't cry. I didn't fall to my knees and thank whatever God was watching. I just felt a cold, hard knot of pragmatism tighten in my gut. I wasn't going to marry him. I wasn't going to let him drain my bank accounts, isolate me from the world, and leave me bleeding on a floor. But I couldn't just dump him. Dean didn't take rejection well. In my past life, when I had tried to leave him before the wedding, he had stood on my front porch for 3 days, crying, threatening himself, manipulating my friends, until I looked like the villain. He was a parasite, and parasites dig in deeper when you try to pull them off. I needed someone else to take him, someone greedy enough to want him, and blind enough to ignore the red flags. A door opened down the hall, heavy footsteps. The overpowering scent of cheap vanilla body spray wafted into my room before she even appeared in the doorway. Harper, are you deaf? My sister asked, leaning against the doorframe. She was wearing a sundress that was a size too small, deliberately cut low. Her lips were glossed, her hair carefully curled. She looked at me, her eyes doing that familiar, quick scan, assessing what I was wearing, how my hair looked, calculating if she was currently winning the unspoken competition she had been waging against me since childhood. I'm coming, I said. My voice sounded raspy, foreign in my own ears. Well, hurry up, Harper snapped, twisting a lock of hair around her finger. Dean brought wine. He looks really good, Nora. Honestly, I don't know how you bagged him. He's out of your league. There it was. The envy. It radiated off her in waves, as tangible as the summer heat. Harper had always wanted my things. If I got a blue bicycle, she screamed, until she got a bluer one. If I got a B on a test, she mocked me for not getting an A, even if she had failed. To Harper, my possessions, my achievements, and my relationships were merely benchmarks for her own self-worth. In the old life, I had ignored her snide comments about Dean. I had thought she was just being her usual, difficult self. Now, looking at her flushed cheeks and the deliberate way she had dressed up for my boyfriend, a slow, cynical smile crept onto my face. I looked down quickly to hide it, grabbing a stack of paper napkins from the desk. "You're right," I said quietly, walking past her into the hallway. "He is something else." The backyard smelled of burning charcoal and citronella. The grass was slightly damp, clinging to the ankles of my jeans. Dean was standing by the grill, holding a beer. When I saw him, my stomach lurched so violently I had to swallow back bile. He looked exactly the same. The sandy blonde hair, the easy, practiced smile that reached his eyes, but never quite warmed them. The expensive linen shirt he couldn't afford. "There she is," he called out, his voice loud. Meant for an audience, he walked over and pulled me into a hug. He smelled like sandalwood and peppermint gum. Underneath that, the metallic tang of sweat. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to shove him backward into the dirt. Instead, I let my arms hang limply at my sides. I didn't hug him back. "You okay, babe?" he murmured, pulling away just enough to look at my face, his brow furrowed in that imitation of concern he had perfected. "You look pale." "Just a headache," I lied, stepping out of his reach. "The heat." "Aw, poor thing." Harper materialized beside us, holding 2 plastic cups of wine. She handed one to Dean, brushing her fingers against his, deliberately. I watched the contact. Dean's eyes flicked to her, a subtle, approving glance that I would have entirely missed 5 years ago. "You should sit down in the shade, Nora," Harper said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "Dean and I can handle the grill." "Right, Dean?" "Sure thing, Harper," he said, giving her a charming wink. I took my cue and retreated to a lawn chair under the oak tree, sipping warm water from a paper cup. For the next hour, I watched them. It was sickeningly fascinating. It was like watching a nature documentary, where 2 predators try to figure out who is going to eat whom. Harper laughed too loudly at his jokes. She leaned in close to point out something on the grill, her shoulder pressing into his chest. Dean, for his part, soaked it up. His ego was a bottomless pit, and Harper was shoveling validation into it with a backhoe. He thrived on female attention. It made him feel powerful. A twisted, ugly part of me felt a phantom sting in my chest. Even knowing what a monster he was, even knowing I wanted to be rid of him, rejection is a physical thing. It's hard to watch someone you once thought you loved easily reciprocate the advances of your own sister. I let the sting wash over me, acknowledged it, and then buried it. I needed this to work. Over the next 3 weeks, I made it easy for them. I became the worst version of myself, carefully curated to push Dean away without triggering his victim complex. I stopped wearing makeup. I complained about being tired and refused to go out on the weekends. When he wanted to talk about his grand, unrealistic business ideas, the ones that would eventually ruin my credit score, I didn't offer my usual blind support. I just yawned and said, "Sounds risky, Dean. Are you sure you're smart enough for that?" His jaw would clench. His eyes would darken. I knew that look. It was the precursor to violence, to the shouting matches that used to leave me weeping on the bathroom floor. But before the tension could snap, I would invite Harper over. "Harper, Dean's having a hard time with his business plan. You're so good at looking at the big picture. Why don't you two talk it out in the living room? I have a migraine. I need to lie down." I would retreat to my bedroom, leaving the door cracked just a fraction of an inch. I listened to the low hum of their voices. I heard the clinking of glasses. I heard Harper's breathy giggle and Dean's arrogant baritone. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling the rough texture of the blanket under my fingernails. And I waited. The shift happened quickly. Dean started texting less. When he did come over, he was distracted, checking his phone constantly. He started wearing a new cologne, something sharper, spicier. Harper, meanwhile, became insufferable. She strutted around our parents' house with a secret, smug smile. She started wearing her hair up exactly the way Dean had once mentioned he liked on women. The trap was set. They were practically begging for the snare to close. I just needed to give them the right moment to hang themselves. It happened on a rainy Thursday in August. Dean was supposed to be at a networking event downtown. Harper had claimed she was going to a movie with a friend. I sat in my apartment, listening to the rain lash against the window panes. The city felt heavy, gray, and washed clean. I looked at my phone, a tracking app I had quietly installed on Dean's tablet the week before, a precaution learned from the bitter paranoia of my past life, showed his location. He wasn't downtown. He was at a cheap motel out on Route 9. I grabbed my keys. The metal felt cold and heavy in my hand. It was time to put on the performance of a lifetime. The motel smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpeting, and ozone from the storm outside. The neon sign buzzed furiously above the front office, casting a sickly pink glow over the parking lot. Dean's car, a leased BMW he couldn't afford, was parked outside room 114. I sat in my beat-up sedan for 10 minutes, watching the rain hammer against the windshield. I practiced my breathing. Inhale, exhale. I needed to look devastated. I needed to look like a woman whose entire world was collapsing, not a woman who felt like she was finally slipping out of a straitjacket. I stepped out into the rain. I didn't use an umbrella. By the time I reached the door of 114, my hair was plastered to my skull, and my clothes were soaked through. I looked pathetic, perfect. I raised my fist and pounded on the door, hard. "Housekeeping," I muttered under my breath, my voice shaking in a way that wasn't entirely fake. The adrenaline was real, a primal response to confrontation. There was a muffled curse from inside, the rustle of sheets, a heavy thud as someone tripped over something. I waited. The doorknob rattled, and the door swung open a few inches, held by the security chain. Dean's face appeared in the gap. He was shirtless. His hair was a mess. When he saw me, all the color drained from his face, leaving him a splotchy, panicked gray. "Nora," he croaked. "Dean?" I made my voice pitch up, trembling at the edges. What are you doing here? I thought you were at the event. I saw your car from the highway." A lie, but a plausible one. I felt sick," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically over his shoulder. "I had to pull over and rest." "Let me in," I said, putting my hand flat against the wet wood of the door. "Let me help you." "No," he pushed back. "Nora, you need to go home. I'm highly contagious, It's a stomach bug. Dean, who is at the door? The voice came from the shadows of the room. It was Harper. I let out a ragged, theatrical gasp. I stepped back, letting the rain wash over my face, hoping it looked like tears. Harper? I whispered, loud enough for both of them to hear. Dean closed his eyes, defeated. His shoulders slumped. The coward in him couldn't maintain the lie once the evidence spoke up. He unlatched the chain and opened the door fully. Harper was sitting on the edge of the unmade bed, clutching a white sheet to her chest. Her makeup was smeared. When she saw me, her eyes widened in genuine shock for a fraction of a second before the smugness returned, settling over her features like a mask. She didn't look sorry. She looked victorious. "Nora," Harper said, her voice steady. "You weren't supposed to find out like this." I didn't say anything. I stood in the doorway, letting the cold air from the AC unit hit my wet clothes. I stared at them. I forced myself to remember the broken ribs. I forced myself to remember the debt collectors banging on my door. I channeled every ounce of that terror and trauma into my expression. My lower lip trembled. I wrapped my arms around myself. "How long?" I managed to choke out. "A month," Dean said softly, looking at the floor. He couldn't even look me in the eye. Typical. "Nora, I didn't want to hurt you. It just happened. We couldn't fight it." "Couldn't fight it?" I repeated, my voice cracking perfectly. Harper stood up, keeping the sheet wrapped tight. She took a step toward me, playing the role of the sympathetic, tragic heroine. "We fell in love, Nora. You and Dean. You were just drifting apart. You never supported his dreams. You never appreciated him. I do. We have a connection you wouldn't understand." It took everything I had not to laugh. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. The copper flavor grounded me. "My own sister," I whispered. I let out a jagged sob, covering my face with my hands. Through the gaps in my fingers, I watched them. Dean looked miserable, wallowing in his own guilt, enjoying the drama of being a man torn between two women. Harper looked triumphant. She had finally taken the ultimate prize from me. "I'm sorry, Nora," Dean said, stepping forward. He reached out to touch my arm. I recoiled violently, slapping his hand away. "Don't touch me," I screamed. The sound echoed in the damp parking lot. "Don't ever touch me again. You deserve each other. You're both disgusting." I turned and ran back to my car. I slipped once on the wet pavement, scraping my knee, which only added to the authenticity of my flight. I scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. I gripped the steering wheel, my chest heaving. I waited for them to follow me, to try and explain, but they didn't. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw Dean close the motel door. The moment the latch clicked shut, the performance ended. I stopped panting. The trembling in my hands ceased. I looked at the neon sign, buzzing in the rain, and a slow, deep breath filled my lungs. The air inside the car smelled like wet wool and old coffee, but to me, it smelled like absolute, pure freedom. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot. The radio turned on automatically, playing some upbeat pop song. I didn't change the station. I had lost my fiancé. I had lost my sister. My parents were going to be a nightmare to deal with once the news broke. I smiled, the cracked skin of my dry lips stretching tight. Harper thought she had stolen a diamond. She had no idea she had just swallowed a hand grenade, and I was going to be 1,000 miles away when the pin finally dropped. My parents' house always smelled of lemon pledge and passive aggression. It was a sterile, aggressively vacuumed environment where negative emotions were swept under the Persian rugs. Right alongside my mother's quiet drinking habit, I sat on the edge of the floral sofa, a mug of Earl Grey cooling in my hands. The porcelain was thin, fragile against my fingertips. I hadn't slept, but I hadn't needed to. I had spent the night in my apartment, meticulously packing my most valuable possessions into a single suitcase and systematically freezing every joint account Dean had ever coerced me into opening. The satisfying snip of heavy-duty scissors slicing through the plastic of his secondary credit card had been the best lullaby I'd ever heard. Now, I was here to detonate the bomb. My mother, Barbara, sat opposite me, her posture rigid. My father, Arthur, stood by the window, jingling the loose change in his pockets, his universal tell for discomfort. "So the wedding is off," my mother stated. She didn't sound devastated. She sounded inconvenienced. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes scanning my face for a crack in my composure. "Are you absolutely sure, Nora? Couples fight. Pre-wedding jitters are perfectly normal." I looked down into the murky brown depths of my tea. He was in a motel room, Mom, with Harper. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the scent of floor wax and denial. My father stopped jingling his change. He cleared his throat, a dry, dusty sound. "Harper?" he asked, his voice weak. "Are you sure? It was dark out, Nora. It was raining. Maybe you were confused." I bit the inside of my cheek. It was a familiar, grounding pain. Even knowing how they operated, even having lived through a lifetime of their favoritism, the instinct to defend the golden child at the expense of my sanity stung. It was a cold, familiar ache just beneath my breastbone. "I stood in the doorway," I said, keeping my voice soft, broken. "The perfect victim. They admitted it. They've been seeing each other for a month." My mother set her cup down. The clatter of ceramic against the glass coffee table was sharp. "Well," she smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her linen trousers, "this is a mess. But Nora, you have to admit, you and Dean have been terribly mismatched lately. You've been so withdrawn. Harper is naturally a very affectionate, passionate girl. Sometimes these things just boil over." Passionate. That was the word she used for Harper's tantrums, her selfishness, her endless greed. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, letting my shoulders shake just a fraction. "I need to pack my old room," I whispered. "I'm moving out of the city for a while. A new job offer upstate. I can't be near them." "That's probably for the best," my mother agreed, entirely too fast. "Give them some space to figure this out without you hanging over them like a dark cloud." I left the living room without another word. The staircase creaked under my weight. In my childhood bedroom, I grabbed the remaining boxes I had left in the closet. Books, a few winter coats, childhood trinkets I didn't care about, but knew Harper would eventually pawn or throw away. As I carried the last box down the stairs, the front door opened. Harper walked in. She looked a little worse for wear. The smugness from the motel had been replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. Her hair was frizzy from the humidity, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Dean, I knew from experience, was an exhausting person to manage. He required constant, exhausting validation. One night of dealing with his manufactured guilt trip had already drained her. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, blocking my path. "Nora," she said. She crossed her arms. "Mom called me. Are you really leaving?" "Excuse me," I said, adjusting the cardboard box in my arms. The corrugated edge dug into my forearm, rough and real. Look, I know you're mad, Harper started, her voice taking on that whining, defensive pitch. But you don't have to act like a martyr. Dean and I have a real connection. He said you suffocated him. You were always nagging him about money and his business. You didn't support his vision. I looked at her, really looked at her. Beneath the cheap perfume in the defensive posture, she was just a foolish, greedy girl clutching a live wire, convinced it was a sparkler. You're right, I said quietly. Harper blinked. What? I didn't support his vision. I nagged him. I suffocated him. I stepped down to the landing, forcing her to step back to make room for me. He needs someone who believes in him, Harper. Someone who will back him up, no matter what. You're much better suited for him than I ever was. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, completely derailed by my lack of a fight. She had come prepared for a screaming match, for tears, for me to claw at her. Instead, I was handing her the crown. She faltered. Yes, exactly. Good luck, I said. I walked out the front door, the heavy oak swinging shut behind me with a solid, satisfying thud. The humid summer air hit me like a physical wave, but for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I could breathe deeply. When I got to my car, I pulled out my phone and checked my banking app. The joint credit card, the one Dean used to pay for his leased BMW, his expensive dinners, his networking trips, was officially frozen. My personal savings, the money I had quietly siphoned away over the last 3 weeks, were locked in a secure account under my name only. Dean's autopay for his car lease was due in 3 days. I started the engine, put the car in drive, and didn't look back in the rearview mirror once. October arrived in a flurry of dying leaves and biting wind. My new apartment was a tiny 3rd-floor walk-up in a sleepy suburb 2 hours north of the city. It smelled perpetually of yeast and burnt sugar from the bakery downstairs. But the radiator hissed a warm, steady rhythm, and the locks on the door were heavy brass. I had taken a job doing data entry for a medical supply logistics firm. It was boring, repetitive work. It involved spreadsheets, fluorescent lights, and absolute silence. I loved it. After a lifetime of Dean's chaotic, boom and bust entrepreneurial phases, the predictability of a bi-weekly paycheck and a quiet cubicle felt like a luxury resort. I bought cheap takeout, ate it on my thrifted sofa, and watched the snow start to gather on the windowsill. I didn't actively seek out news of Harper and Dean. I didn't need to. The grapevine was a tangled, aggressive thing, and my mother was its chief cultivator. My phone buzzed against the cheap laminate of my coffee table. The screen glowed. Mom. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the bite of my cold sesame noodles before I picked it up. Hello, Nora. Finally. My mother's voice was thin, strained. In the background, I could hear the muted roar of the television. I've been trying to reach you all week. I've been busy with work, Mom. What's wrong? A heavy sigh crackled through the speaker. It's Harper and Dean. Things are tense. I took a slow, deliberate chew of my noodles, hiding my smile in the empty apartment. Tense. How so? I thought they were soulmates. Don't be snide, Nora, she snapped, though her heart wasn't in it. Dean's app development business has hit a snag. Some investors pulled out. He's incredibly stressed. And Harper Harper doesn't handle financial stress well. Investors pulled out. I translated that instantly. It meant Dean had run out of the credit line I used to maintain for him, had tried to secure actual venture capital with his half-baked PowerPoint presentations and had been laughed out of the room. "That's a shame," I said mildly. "They had to move out of his luxury apartment downtown," my mother continued, dropping her voice as if she were revealing a state secret. "He lost the lease on the BMW. Harper is furious. She says he lied to her about his finances." My chest tightened for a fraction of a second, not out of sympathy, but from a phantom memory. I remembered the day the repo men came for my car in my past life. I remembered Dean screaming at me, throwing a ceramic bowl against the wall, telling me it was my fault for not working enough overtime to cover the bills. I remembered picking the jagged shards out of the drywall with bleeding fingers. I took a breath. The apartment smelled of sesame oil and old wood. I was safe. "Dean always exaggerated his success," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "But Harper is a supportive partner. I'm sure she'll help him through it. She has her own credit cards, doesn't she?" There was a long pause. When my mother spoke again, she sounded exhausted. "She maxed them out. Dean convinced her to invest in his company, to float them until the next round of funding. Now the interest is piling up. She asked your father and me for a loan." "And did you give it to her?" "We couldn't," she admitted, sounding genuinely defeated. "Arthur's retirement fund took a hit last quarter. We told her she has to figure it out. Now she's crying every day, and Dean is talking about moving them to Florida to start fresh." Moving. The classic parasite maneuver. When the host runs dry, detach and find a new one in a different ecosystem. Only this time, Dean was dragging my sister down with him, and neither of them had the resilience to survive the fall. "They'll be fine, Mom," I lied, enjoying the smooth, easy slide of the words. "They have each other." I hung up the phone and leaned back against the cushions. It was happening faster than I had anticipated. Without my income to prop him up, Dean was sinking like a stone. And Harper, who had only ever wanted the shiny, polished version of a man, was suddenly chained to a desperate, aggressive failure. She thought she had stolen a prince. She was just waking up to find she had chained herself to a cinder block. Over the next 2 months, the updates became more frantic. Harper called me in late November. I almost didn't answer. "Nora," her voice was shaky, lacking the usual arrogant bite. I could hear traffic in the background. She was crying. "What is it, Harper? Do you have a few minutes?" "I'm at the grocery store," I said, lying as I stared at the ceiling fan. "Make it quick. It's Dean. He's changing. He yells so much, Nora. Over everything. Yesterday, he threw his phone at the wall because the internet bill wasn't paid. He said it was my fault for buying groceries instead of paying the utility company." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The progression of his abuse was sickeningly familiar. First, he drains your resources. Then, he isolates you. Then, he breaks you down until you believe his failures are your fault. A small, weak part of me, the part that still remembered being 10 years old and sharing a popsicle with her on the porch, felt a twinge of pity. I could tell her to run. I could tell her to pack a bag, leave her phone behind so he couldn't track her, and vanish. I knew the escape routes because I had mapped them out 100 times in my old life before he finally killed me. But then I remembered her face in the motel room, the smug, triumphant smile as she clutched the sheet to her chest, gloating over the wreckage of my life. She hadn't cared if I survived. She had only cared that she had won. "He's under a lot of pressure, Harper," I said, my voice cold, devoid of any warmth. "You said you understood him better than I did. You said you were his rock. So, be a rock." "Nora, please." We have no money. Could you just loan me? No, I didn't let her finish. I didn't offer excuses. I didn't say I couldn't afford it. I just said no. You're my sister, she sobbed, desperation making her voice shrill. How can you be so cruel? I have nothing. You have exactly what you stole, Harper, I said softly. Enjoy it. I pressed end call and blocked her number. I didn't feel guilty. I just felt tired. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the radiator lull me into a dreamless sleep. The invitation arrived in a muddy snowstorm in late January. It was a flimsy piece of cardstock, the kind you buy in bulk at a discount office supply store. The ink was slightly smeared, printed from a home inkjet printer running low on toner. Harper and Dean cordially invite you to celebrate their union. No date at a fancy country club. No bespoke calligraphy. It was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in a VFW hall out in the industrial park sector of our hometown. A shotgun wedding, forced by the sheer, crushing weight of their mutual misery. They needed cash, and a wedding, even a cheap one, was a desperate bid for envelopes full of checks from extended family. I hadn't planned on going, but as I held the flimsy paper, feeling its cheap texture between my fingers, a dark, cynical curiosity took hold of me. I wanted to see the end of the first act. I wanted to see the reality of what they had built together. I took the day off work. I drove the 2 hours south through gray slush and a biting, bitter wind. The VFW hall smelled of old beer, institutional floor cleaner, and stale cigarettes. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an irritable, flickering energy. There were perhaps 30 people there, mostly older relatives who looked deeply uncomfortable, sitting on cold metal folding chairs. I slipped into the back row, wearing a simple, dark gray wool coat. I didn't check my coat. I didn't plan on staying long. My mother spotted me from the front row. She looked 10 years older. The skin around her eyes was tight with stress, and she was clutching her purse like a life preserver. She didn't come over to me. She just gave me a tight, grim nod. The music started. It wasn't a string quartet. It was a CD playing through a scratchy PA system. The volume turned up slightly too high, making the treble crackle. Dean walked out first from a side door. I had to suppress a sharp intake of breath. He looked terrible. The confident, golden boy veneer was entirely gone. He had lost weight, making his cheekbones look sharp and hungry. He was wearing a suit I recognized, the one I had bought him for my cousin's funeral 3 years ago. But it hung off his frame now. There were deep, purple bruises of exhaustion under his eyes. He stood at the front, shifting his weight nervously, not looking at anyone. He looked like a cornered animal. Then, the doors at the back opened. Harper walked in. She was accompanied by my father, who looked like he was marching to an execution. Harper's dress was a disaster. It was a mass-produced polyester nightmare, stark white and far too tight around her waist and hips, clearly bought off a clearance rack and never tailored. The fabric looked stiff, unforgiving. She had tried to compensate with heavy makeup, but the foundation only highlighted the stress breakouts along her jawline. She looked down the aisle. She didn't look like a woman in love. She looked terrified. As she walked past my row, her eyes snagged on mine. I didn't scowl. I didn't look angry. I just sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, and I gave her a small, polite smile. Harper's step faltered. Her knuckles, gripping a pathetic bouquet of slightly wilted grocery store roses, turned bone white. She recognized the look on my face. It wasn't the look of a jealous ex. It was the look of a spectator at an autopsy. The The ceremony was excruciatingly short. The officiant, a bored-looking justice of the peace, rushed through the vows as if he had a meter running outside. "Do you, Dean, take this woman?" Dean mumbled his assent. His eyes darted toward the exit door twice during the 2-minute speech. "Do you, Harper, take this man?" Harper swallowed hard. Her voice, when it came, was thin and wavering. "I do." When they were pronounced husband and wife, Dean didn't sweep her into a passionate kiss. He leaned in and gave her a stiff, obligatory peck on the lips, pulling away quickly. The applause from the metal chairs was sparse, sounding hollow in the cavernous, smelly hall. I stood up before they even began their recessional walk back down the aisle. I walked out the double doors into the small foyer. There was a folding table set up against the wall, covered in a cheap paper tablecloth. On it sat a 3-tiered cake. I walked over to it. The fondant was thick and shiny, but there was a visible crack running down the back of the bottom tier, hastily patched with smeared buttercream. It smelled of artificial vanilla and desperation. Next to the cake was a small, slotted cardboard box wrapped in shiny paper. Card box. A handwritten sign read, "The true purpose of this entire grim exercise." The double doors opened behind me. The meager crowd began to filter out toward the reception area. "Nora," I turned. Dean was standing a few feet away. He had abandoned his new wife somewhere in the crowd to intercept me. Up close, the deterioration was even more striking. He smelled of sweat and fear, completely overpowering the cheap cologne he was trying to use to mask it. "You came," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate, gravelly tone he used to use when he wanted something from me. "I did," I said evenly. "Congratulations, Dean." He took a step closer, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "Nora, listen. This is all a mistake. Harper, she's suffocating me. She doesn't understand the pressure I'm under. I miss how easy it was with us. You always kept me grounded." The audacity of it was almost awe-inspiring. He was standing outside his own wedding reception, his new bride 20 feet away, trying to reel his old host back in because the new one was out of blood. I looked at him, the man who, in another life, had taken everything from me, my money, my sanity, my life. I looked at his weak chin, his panicked eyes, the pathetic slouch of his shoulders. I didn't feel rage anymore. I just felt a profound, overwhelming disgust. "You misunderstand, Dean," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but sharp as broken glass. "I didn't keep you grounded. I kept you afloat. And now, you're drowning." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope. I stepped past him and dropped it into the cardboard box on the table. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud. "What's that?" he asked, blinking in confusion. "My wedding gift," I said. I walked out the front doors of the VFW hall, stepping out into the freezing slush. The cold air hit my lungs, crisp and clean, washing away the smell of cheap cake and despair. I got into my car and turned the heater on full blast. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I imagined Dean tearing into that envelope, hoping for a check, hoping for a lifeline. Instead, he would find a single, neatly folded sheet of paper. On it, printed in plain black ink, was the phone number of a bankruptcy lawyer I had found online. I merged onto the highway, heading north, back to my quiet life, my warm radiator, and my boring job. Behind me, the trap had finally clicked entirely shut. They were married. They were broke. They were legally bound to each other's financial ruin, sinking in a swamp of their own making. and they had a lifetime to realize exactly what they had done to themselves. Peace is a startlingly quiet thing. When you spend years bracing for an explosion, the slammed doors, the overdraft alerts, the sudden violence of a man realizing the world doesn't owe him a living, the absence of that tension feels unnatural at first. For the first 18 months in my new town, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I would wake up at 3 a.m., my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I heard Dean's heavy boots on the stairs. But there was only the hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of ozone, and wet pavement from an open window. By the spring of 2021, the phantom terrors finally began to fade. I was promoted to operations manager at the logistics firm. It came with a modest raise, a small office with a window overlooking an alley, and a profound sense of ownership. I bought a real sofa, upholstered in thick, forest green corduroy. I bought heavy ceramic plates that didn't chip when you washed them. I was standing at my kitchen counter, pressing the plunger down on my French press, when the phone rang. The screen read, "Dad." My father never called me. In the architecture of my family, he was the passive bystander, the man who retreated to his garage to avoid my mother's anxious micromanaging and Harper's endless theatrics. I slid my thumb across the glass. "Dad?" "Nora." His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across a driveway. It was thin, entirely devoid of its usual placid detachment. "I'm sorry to bother you at work. It's my day off," I said, pouring the dark, oily coffee into a mug. The steam rose, smelling of dark chocolate and burnt earth. "What's wrong? Is Mom okay?" "Your mother is. She's in bed. She had a bit of a collapse yesterday. The paramedics came and gave her a sedative." I stopped pouring. A cold prickle of adrenaline washed down the back of my neck. "What happened?" He let out a long, shuddering breath. "It's your sister. And Dean. The police were here, Nora." I set the French press down. The glass clinked sharply against the granite counter. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the sink. I didn't feel panic. I just felt a dark, heavy validation settle into my bones. "Tell me," I said flatly. My father's words came out in disjointed chunks, heavy with shame. The picture he painted was a masterpiece of desperation. Over the last year and a half, Dean's app had completely folded. To maintain the illusion of success, he had resorted to taking out predatory payday loans. When those ran dry, he turned to identity theft. He opened credit cards in Harper's name. My father choked out. "In your mother's name, too." He intercepted the mail. We didn't know until the collection agencies started calling the house. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, Nora. He took a second mortgage on that cheap townhouse they were renting. I don't even know how he forged the documents, but he did. "Where is he?" I asked, looking at my own reflection in the dark kitchen window. "Gone. He packed his car 3 nights ago and drove off. Left Harper with a stack of final notices and a depleted checking account. The landlord evicted her yesterday. She showed up here with 2 trash bags of clothes. That's when your mother stopped breathing." I closed my eyes. The smell of the coffee turned suddenly acidic in my stomach. I remembered the heavy, suffocating weight of debt in my past life. I remembered the sick, dizzying terror of checking the mailbox, knowing there would be another neon-colored envelope threatening ruin. Dean hadn't just drained Harper. He had gutted her and left the carcass for our parents to deal with. "Are they pressing charges?" I asked. "I am," my father said. The steel in his voice surprised me. "Your mother wants to protect him for Harper's sake. She's delusional, Nora. She thinks he'll come back and fix it. But I gave the police everything. He ruined my retirement. He ruined your sister. I didn't offer sympathy. I couldn't. Sympathy required a baseline of surprise. And I was entirely unsurprised. Keep the doors locked, Dad, I said, my voice unnervingly calm. If Dean is backed into a corner, he gets dangerous. Change the locks. Don't let Mom answer the phone. You sound like you know, he whispered. I know enough, I replied. Take care of yourself, Dad. I hung up the phone. The kitchen was perfectly quiet. I took a sip of my coffee. It was bitter, but it was hot, and it was mine. I paid for the beans with money no one could touch. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had crushed the bones completely. She lasted exactly 3 weeks at our parents' house before the implosion. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The wind outside was rattling the window frames of my apartment, driving a sleety, miserable rain against the glass. I was curled up on the corduroy sofa, a wool blanket over my legs, grading a stack of inventory manifests. When the intercom buzzer screamed, I jumped, my pen skidding across the paper. Nobody visited me unannounced. The delivery driver usually just left boxes in the lobby. I walked over to the entry panel and pressed the speaker button. Yes, static crackled. Then a voice, wet and ragged. Nora, it's me. Please buzz me in. I'm freezing. I stood perfectly still. The linoleum floor was cold under my socks. The instinct to press the unlock button was deeply ingrained. A childhood reflex of fixing things for my younger sister, of smoothing over her messes. But the memory of the hardwood floor meeting my skull in the old life paralyzed my finger. How did you find my address, Harper? I looked at Mom's phone. She sobbed. Nora, please. Dad kicked me out. We had a screaming match. He called me a parasite. Please. It's raining. I looked at the heavy brass deadbolt on my door. I weighed my peace against her misery. I'll buzz you up, I said quietly. But you aren't staying. I pressed the button. A minute later, there was a tentative knock at my door. I unlocked it and pulled it open. Harper looked like a drowned rat. The glamorous, smug woman who had sat on the motel bed, wrapped in a sheet, was entirely gone. Her blonde hair was a matted, stringy mess, the dark roots growing out 3 inches from her scalp. She was wearing a cheap, oversized, puffy coat that smelled of wet dog and stale cigarette smoke. She had lost at least 20 pounds. Her cheekbones were sharp, her eyes sunken and rimmed with red. She stood in the hallway, shivering violently, a single black duffel bag clutched in her hands. Can I come in? She asked, her teeth literally chattering. I stepped back, opening the door wider. I didn't offer to take her coat. I pointed to the small wooden stool in the kitchen area. Sit there. Don't put your bag on the sofa. She shuffled in, leaving wet footprints on the laminate flooring. She dropped the bag onto the floor and collapsed onto the stool. She looked around my apartment, at the clean counters, the thriving plants, the warm, soft lighting. Her face twisted into an ugly expression of envy and grief. You did well for yourself, she muttered, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. I work hard, I said, putting a kettle on the stove. And I don't let people steal from me. She flinched, as if I had struck her. You don't have to be a bitch about it, Nora. I'm practically homeless. Dad threw me out. He said he couldn't look at me because every time he did, he remembered his empty savings account. He's grieving his future, Harper. The one you and Dean stole from him. It was Dean, she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the small kitchen. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. It wasn't me. I didn't know he was forging signatures. I didn't know he was stealing. He told me the business was struggling, but he said He had a line of credit. I trusted him. I loved him. I turned around, leaning against the sink. The kettle began to hiss behind me. You love the idea of him, I corrected her, my voice low and steady. You loved that he wore nice suits and bought you expensive dinners. You loved that he belonged to me, and you wanted to take him. You didn't care who he really was. You didn't warn me, she cried, angry tears spilling down her hollow cheeks. You knew he was awful. You set me up, Nora. I know you did. You just handed him to me and walked away. You let me ruin my life. The sheer, monumental audacity of her logic took my breath away for a second. The kettle clicked off, boiling. I poured the hot water into a mug, steeped a tea bag for exactly 10 seconds, and set it on the counter in front of her. Drink, I said. She stared at the mug, then looked up at me, her chest heaving. You broke into my life, Harper, I said, leaning in so she could see the absolute lack of pity in my eyes. You pursued him. You slept with him. You sat in that motel room and gloated because you thought you had stolen the prize. I didn't force you to sign any papers. I didn't force you to ignore the red flags. You ignored them because your greed was louder than your common sense. He hit me, she whispered, her voice breaking. The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged. My stomach clenched. I looked at her cheek. Under the harsh kitchen light, beneath the smeared dirt and rain, I saw the faint, yellowish-green shadow of a fading bruise along her jawline. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, the two timelines bled together. I felt the phantom ache in my ribs. I tasted the copper in my mouth. I saw Dean's face, contorted in rage, his fist coming down. A wave of nausea hit me so hard, I had to grip the counter to stay upright. The contradiction tore at my chest. I hated her for what she had done, but the visceral horror of being a woman at the mercy of Dean's fists was a sisterhood I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I pushed the memories back down into the dark box where they belonged and locked the lid. Did you go to the police about the assault? I asked, my voice softer now, but completely hollow. She shook her head. I was scared and embarrassed. Everyone already thinks I'm a joke. I have nothing left, Nora. My credit is in the 400s. I can't get an apartment. I can't even get a cell phone plan. Please, let me stay here. Just for a month. Just until I get a job. She looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes. The same eyes she used when we were 7, and she wanted my allowance. I looked at my sanctuary, my quiet, safe life. If I let her stay, she would bring the chaos with her. She would bring the debt collectors. She would bring the drama. And eventually, she would bring Dean's attention right to my doorstep. I couldn't save her without drowning myself, and I had already died once. I refused to do it again. I reached into the junk drawer next to the oven and pulled out a notepad. I wrote down the address of a women's shelter in the city, along with the phone number of a legal aid clinic. I ripped the sheet off and slid it across the counter, next to the tea. What is this? She asked, staring at the paper. That shelter has beds available. I checked online when Dad called me, I said. They have advocates who can help you file a police report against Dean for the assault and the fraud. Harper looked at the paper, then at me. Her face hardened, the vulnerability vanishing, replaced by a bitter, venomous spite. You're turning me out, your own sister. I can't save you from the fire you set to burn me, Harper, I said. Drink your tea, and then you need to leave. She didn't drink the tea. She stood up, the legs of the stool scraping harshly against the floor. She grabbed her wet duffel bag. "You're a monster," she spat, her lip curling. "You're cold, and you're dead inside. Goodbye, Harper." She walked to the door, her wet boots squeaking. She yanked it open, letting the cold air from the hallway rush in, and slammed it behind her so hard the framed print on my wall rattled. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I listened to the rain. I picked up her untouched mug of tea and poured it down the drain, watching the brown liquid swirl into the dark pipes. I locked the deadbolt, double-checked the chain, and went back to my corduroy sofa. I didn't cry. The silence in the apartment just felt a little heavier, a little more permanent. They caught Dean in Phoenix. 6 months later, he was pulled over for a broken taillight. When the officer ran his plates, the warrants popped up like fireworks. Grand theft, wire fraud, identity theft, and evading law enforcement. My father called to tell me the news. He sounded lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from his lungs. Dean was extradited back to Maryland, denied bail, and forced to face the wreckage he had left behind. Without his expensive suits, his BMW, and his slick charm, the public defender couldn't do much for him. He took a plea deal, 7 years in a state penitentiary. When I heard the sentence, I was standing in the aisle of a hardware store, picking out paint samples for the small, 2-bedroom house I had just closed on. I held a swatch of pale yellow cardboard in my hand. I stared at the color, letting the reality of the numbers wash over me. 7 years. I would be 32 by the time he saw the outside of a cell. My credit would be immaculate. My house would be fully paid down. I would be untouchable. The ghost that had haunted my spine since the moment I woke up in my childhood bedroom finally, quietly, let go. I exhaled, feeling the tension drain out of my shoulders, my jaw, my hands. It was over. It wasn't until a year later, in the humid grip of July 2023, that I saw her again. I had driven back to my hometown for a dentist appointment, a holdover from my old life, simply because I liked the hygienist and hadn't bothered to find a new one. After the appointment, my mouth numb from Novocaine, I stopped at a roadside diner on Route 9 for a cup of coffee before the drive back north. The diner smelled of old frying grease, burnt filter coffee, and lemon disinfectant. The vinyl on the booths was cracked and taped over with duct tape. I sat at a small table near the window, watching the heat shimmer off the asphalt in the parking lot. The bell above the door jingled, but I didn't look up until I heard the heavy, dragging footsteps approach my table. "What can I get you?" The voice was flat, exhausted, devoid of any melody. I looked up. Harper was standing there, holding a stained plastic menu and a coffee pot. She was wearing a hideous, mustard yellow uniform dress. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, messy bun, held together by a cheap plastic clip. The skin around her eyes was deeply lined, and she had a permanent, bitter downturn to her mouth. She looked 40, though she was only 26. When her eyes met mine, she froze. The coffee pot in her hand trembled slightly, making the dark liquid slosh against the glass. We stared at each other for a long, agonizing moment. The ambient noise of the diner, the clattering plates, the hiss of the grill, the low murmur of truckers seemed to fade into a dull roar. I looked at the crooked name tag pinned to her chest. Harper. I looked at her hands. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, the cuticles red and raw. She wasn't wearing a wedding ring. She wasn't wearing anything of value. She was completely, entirely hollowed out. The tragedy of it was suffocating. If things had gone the way they were supposed to, it would be me standing in that mustard uniform, broken and indebted, while Harper sat in her designer clothes, judging my failure. But the universe had blinked, and I had stepped out of the way of the train. Harper had eagerly jumped onto the tracks to pick up a shiny dime. I didn't feel smug. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt a profound, exhausting sadness for the absolute waste of it all. Harper didn't say my name. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. The fight had been completely beaten out of her. Her eyes dropped to the linoleum floor. She took a step back, her shoulders slumping, turning her face away so I couldn't see the flush of supreme humiliation creeping up her neck. I'll send another waitress," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ceiling fans. She turned and walked away, disappearing through the swinging doors into the kitchen. I sat there for a minute, looking at the empty space where she had stood. The smell of the grease suddenly made my stomach turn. I opened my purse. I pulled out my wallet and extracted a crisp, clean $100 bill. It was the emergency cash I always carried, a habit formed from the paranoia of my past. I set the bill on the table, placing the heavy ceramic sugar dispenser over the corner so it wouldn't blow away. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a toll, a final payment to cross the river and leave the dead where they belonged. I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored coat, and walked out the door. The heat of the parking lot hit me like a physical force, but I welcomed it. I got into my car, started the engine, and merged onto the highway. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. If you felt the chilling satisfaction of watching the ultimate trap close, let me know in the comments below. Would you have let Harper stay, or did Nora do the right thing by locking the door? Drop a like if you believe that sometimes walking away is the most devastating revenge of all. Don't forget to share the story with anyone who needs a reminder to trust their instincts and cut dead weight. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deeply human, raw storytelling where karma doesn't just knock, it breaks the door down. See you in the next one.